My name is John. I am the Reasonable Faith Chapter Director for Southern Colorado. And it is through this office that I've had the privilege of presenting on various topics, not just in Southern Colorado, but throughout Colorado and using virtual technology across other states as well. Through our international book study that we host every month, we've been able to share content on cosmology and consciousness with people around the globe over the last few months. And I have been getting a lot of questions regarding critical race theory, what I do with that, kind of my bent, if you would. So I wanted to take a couple minutes just to put this together. I've given the critical race theory talks to professors in other states, to university students here in Colorado, to not just academic groups, but I've shared a little bit with church settings, just casual people that I run into. And recently, I thought it would be good to record something just to kind of share a brief overview of my approach, how I like to come at things. And hopefully this will answer a few questions as it relates to my stance. So what I want my own background personally, so I am currently in school. I am a graduate student in data science at Texas Tech. My undergraduate was in science from Colorado State. So there's this empirical side to me, which is curious about data, evidence, critical thinking. And then there's this philosophical side. I've been involved in churches, speaking in churches for longer than 10 years. And I've been passionate about the deeper questions. So not just theology, the study of God and God's impact on reality, but also when we make statements, how do we evaluate their truthfulness, ethics, those types of things. Those are not necessarily approached empirically. Those are approached more philosophically, which has been motivating to me. And critical race theory was interesting because it's a neat intersection, not just between the various sides of me. For instance, morality as it relates to racial relations is a huge passion of mine. More so morality, more so than racial relations. The passion for racial relations came just because as a Black man in the United States, I've been able to have quite a few experiences that make the conversation about race very relevant to me. And then the data science side of me, the empirical side, is useful because it's not just about the numbers, because there are numbers, there are studies, there are statistics that go into critical race theory, but it sort of provides a framework for my philosophical side, right? It's not just theories for theory's sake, but how do we tie this to evidence? How do we tie this to experience? Those types of things. So that's a little bit about me. You can find, if you're curious, we have a website. You should see it in the intro, johnangie.org, no hyphen. There's a lot more information available on that site. So let's just jump into kind of how I go through this talk. I'm not going to dive super deep into this. If you want to go deeper on any of this, feel free to contact us at the website and we can go way deeper into this. But essentially, when I give this talk, I do a couple of things. I give a survey of critical theory. So critical theory is the ideology that gave birth to critical race theory. We sometimes look at some case studies. That goes back to the side of me that looks at the numbers. And then I share my approach, which is kind of fun, right? Because a lot of people don't approach these types of topics in the same way. And for me, as a person that believes that the universe is not a random system, as a person that believes that right and wrong are not arbitrary, my spin, my approach to critical race theory is I would not say is very normal. A lot of the speakers that I hear typically seem to come from a different angle, largely because my critical race theory approach isn't built on necessarily experience. I think a lot of people, when they talk about racial relations, there's not necessarily a goal in mind per se. Like racial reconciliation is this idea of how do we get past all the conflict and get into more harmony among various racial groups and ethnic groups. And I agree with that. But as you'll see here in a minute, I think the way forward towards that isn't one necessarily that begins and ends with experience, but also considers, is there a way to think about this? Which I recognize is fairly controversial. Some people don't agree with that. They think any way you think about this is fine. And yet I personally wouldn't agree with that. And I'll explain in a minute. So I talk about my approach, and then I offer suggestions for improving racial relations, and then some next steps. So I'm just going to briefly hit these. And like I said, if you want me to go deeper, feel free to reach out, and I can do that for you. So let's start with a quote that I like. Andy Stanley, writer, speaker. He has this quote. He says, "Direction, not intention, determines destination." And I think, I'm gonna say it again. Direction, not intention, determines destination. I think that quote is really, really good, because what's the destination? When we look at the news, when we listen to people go on and on about racial conflict, the destination that many people want to see is more harmony, as I said before. That's the intention. But the intention is not what gets us there. The direction is. That's why I like this quote. The direction asks, what steps are we taking? And are those steps in line with our intention to get us to this point? And I don't think our direction is always in line with our destination. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But that quote I like a lot. And I have some questions to that. So the questions I ask myself is, what gets in the way of our ability as various racial groups to experience harmony? And as I see it, the primary barrier, and this is where I start to get controversial, and in the full talk I go into it in more depth, but I think the primary barrier is actually spiritual. In fields like psychology, there is starting to be more recognition in the literature of the spiritual realm. I had a great conversation with a very well-respected psychologist / counselor specializing in PTSD and trauma in my area not too long ago. And he actually was the one that brought that to my awareness in the literature. And yet I think there are still spaces where recognition of the metaphysical is underdeveloped. And I think that is, like I said, I go into more depth, but I think that that's unwise. So I believe that there's a spiritual barrier. And then I think right behind the spiritual barrier, there is a emotional and intellectual barrier. And so the third level down is, I think, where the physical comes in. So where I differ is that I think a lot of people start with the physical. They start with the kind of the history of transgressions, if you would, and then they go into personal mistreatment, right? And then from there, a lot of times I hear speakers try to make claims about what ought to be based on what has been. And if you're not new to philosophy, you know that that's not necessarily a linear inference, or a linear thought pattern. We believe that you should be able to determine truthfulness and what ought to be done more on principle per se, not necessarily on past pain and prejudice. And so I try to start with the spiritual, emotional, and intellectual in my approach, and say, regardless of where you come from or what you've been through or how you feel about things, here's my really controversial question. Is there a right and wrong way to even think about these things? Race. Is there a right and wrong way to even think about it? Because if there is, then we know that our actions come from our thought patterns, that everything starts epistemically, starts between our ears. And so that's where I like to begin and end really my talks, is in that space. The next piece that I go into is, like I said, a history of critical theory. Briefly, you should know that it's really something that comes from our Marxist ideology, the Frankfurt School in the 1920s in Germany. this idea of liberation from oppression is a very old idea, and it has taken many, many forms. And so we go into the history of critical theory when I do the full talks. And then I talk about kind of the three components to critical theory. Critical theory can be broken down into identity, liberation, and accessing truth. Identity, liberation, and accessing truth. So it's from those three things. It's from critical theory that you get into critical race theory. And I just want to say this really quick, because in my next section, I actually talk about positive aspects of critical theory, not even critical race theory, like critical theory, which can spin off into critical race theory, critical gender theory, all types of offshoots of critical theory. And I think a lot of this gets a bad rap specifically in the church, because I think the church sees it as just totally opposite to the gospel, and that it breeds a lack of faith, it breeds dissension. And I think that that's true if you don't precisely articulate your terms. What I try to do, once again, is I try to move away from what has been, and I try to say, if we just identify clearly our terminology and we try to capture the heart of what was maybe originally intended, then we find that things like oppression aren't anti-Christian. And by heavens, if someone said oppression is not a reality or hasn't been a reality, I would be concerned about other things at that point. I think it's very well understood that oppression has taken place. I think it's very well understood that that's not anti-Christian. Another idea would be that power can corrupt a perception of reality. This is another kind of key idea in critical theory. And once again, I don't think any Bible scholar who has studied any of the kingdoms of the Old Testament, from the Pharaohs to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Cyrus the Great, the Persians, Alexander the Great, Seleucus, the New Testament, the Rome. I mean, I don't think anyone would necessarily disagree the Pharisaical and Sadducees, the different sects. I don't think anyone would disagree that power can change one's view of reality. So I don't think that's an issue either. And then finally, this concept of hegemony, which kind of dovetails from the last one. So I think there are positive aspects, and I think there are points of integration, which I go more into when I give the full talk. And then I get into critical race theory, kind of how that context, especially in the West, has historically been kind of seen between the Caucasian and Black American groups. We kind of talk a little bit about the history of slavery, the Naturalization Act, the Black Codes, Jim Crow. We kind of walk through that a little bit. And then we come to current day America, and we talk about, like I said, we could do case studies. And it's at this point that I get more into like my approach to this. So after we look at the history of critical theory, the history of critical race theory, after we've kind of sat with this question of, is there a right and wrong way to think about these things, I like to break that down. So what I will do is I'll start with, right and wrong as its own individual thing, more reasoning, kind of look at that. Then I'll get into right and wrong thinking, epistemology, formal and informal rules of engagement, and various things there. Before I get to race, what race is, what does race mean, those types of things. And then finally, once I kind of walk through, okay, now that we understand the question, I begin to share arguments that I've created, that I've had viewed by colleagues all over the world in various levels of academia and the church. Arguments that are, in my mind, very helpful with at least starting the discussion. And I hope to develop them further. I don't think they're necessarily bulletproof or anything like that, but I do think that they're the product of thought, and they can only get better with time from that perspective. And so once again, I have never seen a critical race theorist present an argument in support of their idea surrounding critical race theory. Like, I've never seen philosophical argumentation deployed to that degree. And I could be mistaken. I haven't heard or seen everybody. I just know a lot of times if I'm sitting in a critical race talk, it's incredibly emotive and tied up around the existential, which isn't bad. It's actually an important component. I just don't know necessarily, once again, going back to that quote of it's direction, not intention, that determines destination. I'm concerned, and the feedback that I've received over the years has been many people appreciate my approach because it allows everyone to come to the table with equal footing. There's no privileged perspective, and for everyone to make movement towards reconciliation rather than kind of a hierarchy developing, not necessarily in a hegemony stance, but more of like this group, due to victimization or due to oppression or due to being a bystander or due to X, Y, or Z in the conversation, here's kind of your place in this conversation. And thus you either have an advantage or disadvantage throughout the entire exchange almost, versus saying, here's the standard. Everyone evaluate where you are into that standard and let's figure out how to move there together. So I have found that a little more helpful. Let's see. Some of the final things that I do are I try to give some practical ways forward that I think this is where I get more into the experiential, only as a mechanism for action, right? So at some point we need to talk about practical steps or history. What have I experienced? And this is typically where I do it. I do it after I've laid the foundation of thought, as thought relates to my metaphysical position, my intellectual understanding of various things, and my kind of emotional disposition, if you would. And so as far as age groups and appropriateness, yeah, I mean, I've given this talks to all, I've talked about some of this stuff with all age groups. If I'm talking to an academic audience, I've got a very long presentation where we can really slow down on some of these pieces and break them wide open. As far as maybe an older non-academic audience, like if I'm speaking to a church, I usually can stay away from the trenches as far as jargon or going to the nth degree on a certain ideology, and we can kind of move through at a good pace and still have a very engaging dialogue with those deeper pieces available if someone's interested. For younger audiences, whenever I talk to younger audiences, we make things age appropriate. We shift current events, as I believe that when I talk to college students or high school students, the current events that are really relevant differ among the age groups. So we adjust it there. Have great feedbacks. I got feedback from some young kids, middle school kids, that just said that was very, very engaging recently, and they really, really enjoyed it. And I only briefly, I mean, I was there talking about not critical race theory per se. Like I was actually talking about some of my other stances on maybe even hairier issues. I touched on abortion, and the pro-life perspective. I touched on more of Christian versus non-Christian views in the marketplace. And so critical race theory was a part of that. And the young people that were there found it incredibly engaging and user-friendly. So can tailor to age groups, and then just try to show how this direction, this approach, I believe, gets us to racial reconciliation. I've actually witnessed, so I had a group at the college, several students that represented various groups after the organization Ratio Christi, led by Rick Simi, Brian Blevins, Josh Stoll, a lot of the great students there. They put on a thing last year and during the global pandemic in 2020. And we did this thing. It might have been slightly before that. I think it was during the pandemic. And the turnout was fantastic as far as racial representation. And what was so cool was some of the students and some of the various demographics engaged differently, and emotions really got high. And what I appreciated was we almost had to see if it worked in real time, because pain came to the surface in the middle of in the beginning, I was sharing various intellectual pieces and everybody was like, yeah, woo, yeah. And I get to the end and it's like emotions, as I'm getting to the end, emotions are rising and rising. And at one point I remember the conversation seemed like it might get derailed because emotions just got so high and all sides of the dialogue felt like misunderstood, And so we actually had to kind of take a second and deploy some of the approaches that I suggested in real time, and it worked. And we got to taste reconciliation among strangers in real time in the span of in this like microcosm of the of America as a whole. And I remember people coming up to me afterwards and saying that was cool, right? Like I did not think that was possible. So I feel at this point pretty encouraged at the approach that we take. And I keep saying we, my wife and I, when you see our website, you'll kind of see how we approach things and various things. So that is a brief overview of how I approach critical race theory. Once again, the question is there a right and a wrong way to approach even thinking about these things? And you've heard it here first. You heard it here. I tell you, I have really struggled to hear people really engage on that on a epistemological level. Epistemology is the study of language. An objective moral reasoning perspective, or just moral reasoning as a category. And then second, the idea that it is direction, not intention, that determines destination. If the goal is to improve the exchange among races, what's our direction right now? Like, are we producing fruit in that direction, or is it only getting worse and we're just a bunch of people with good intentions, not really making wise steps? And I believe that the way that I deploy it in my talks has actually produced fruit, and I'm excited to see that spread. So that's me in a nutshell. It's my story. That's my brief approach. If you have more questions, www.johnangie.org. John Angie, one word. You can find contact information, schedules. Feel free to reach out, emails. We do it all. Would love to answer more questions. And I look forward to seeing you guys again real soon for our next video monthly installment. And I hope you guys have a great night. Thank you. Bye-bye.